The good news is that electric vehicles dramatically reduce emissions, even when you take into account how the electricity fueling them is generated. And here we point to a resource that the Union of Concerned Scientists maintains. It's called their EV emissions tool. And what this tool allows you to do is choose any electric vehicle model and plug in a zip code. And this tool will calculate for you the relative emissions of that vehicle plugged into your local electric grid and show you how efficient a gas-powered car would need to be to have the same emissions as that electric vehicle. So here we just pulled out two somewhat random examples. So we've got a 2023 Chevy Bolt charging in a Boston zip code. And it shows you that that vehicle is so efficient that you would, if you wanted a gas car to produce the same amount of emissions per mile, it would need to get 130 miles per gallon. And for a 2022 Tesla Model Y charging in Providence, you'd need to have a gas car that goes 140, that gets 140 miles per gallon to have the same per mile emissions. That's really incredible. We've been working on internal combustion engines for over 100 years. We are nowhere near 130 or 140 miles per gallon. But one thing I want to underline with this source is that the Union of Concerned Scientists for this graphic uses regional data. So they're looking at the New England power grid as a whole. But thanks to those standards that I mentioned earlier, the electricity supply in Massachusetts and Rhode Island specifically is even cleaner. So the emissions reductions are even more for EVs charged up in our two states. And if you are one of an increasing number of residents of the two states who are enrolled in a green municipal aggregation program, your emissions will be even lower. If you haven't heard of green municipal aggregation, that's a program where municipalities go out and procure electricity for the city or town as a whole. And what they often do is add in more renewable energy than is required by state law. So if you're in one of those communities, you might have 5 or 10 or 15% more renewable energy in your mix than the state as a whole. And they also often give you the option to opt up to 100% renewable energy. And if you do that, your emissions go down all the way to zero. One cool way to see this in real time or to see the impact of electric vehicles in real time is to look at data from the Environmental Protection Agency in their 2024 Automotive Trends report. And this report is very, very long. We wrote a whole blog post about it, or Caroline wrote a whole blog post about it that you can read on our website. But we wanted to pull out this graphic in particular because it shows how important electric vehicles have been in the past decade to decreasing emissions and increasing efficiency. So in the graph on the left, you see the real world carbon dioxide emissions on a gram per mile basis of the fleet overall from 1975 to 2025. And you can see that that line has really decreased over time. And on the right, you can see the real world fuel economy or the miles per gallon of the fleet overall in the same time period. And you can see that that sort of conversely has gone up a lot. If you look really closely at the time period between 2015 and 2025, you see that the line splits into two. So the solid line shows you the trend for all vehicles that are model year 2023. And you can see that that decreases quite a bit from 2021 to 2022 to 2023 is when there's the starkest decrease in emissions and the starkest increase in efficiency. But if you look at the dotted line right next to it, that is the line of what all model year 2023 vehicles look like if you remove all the battery electric vehicles and all the plug-in hybrids. And you can see that if you remove all the plug-in vehicles, the trend line basically flattens out. You don't see any decreases in per mile emissions, and you don't really see any increases in efficiency once you take out all of the electric vehicles. And to us, that further proves the point that we've squeezed everything we can squeeze out of internal combustion engines. And to see the sorts of efficiency gains and emissions reductions that we need to see in the coming years, electric vehicles are what's going to achieve that. So far, we've been talking about emissions on a grams per mile basis or just a per mile basis, but obviously we want to look at the whole life cycle of the vehicle. And for that, we point again to a different resource by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which did what's called a cradle to grave analysis of the global warming emissions of manufacturing and operating a car and a truck, gas one and electric one in both cases. So to interpret this graph, you'll notice that the left two bars are about cars, the right two bars are about trucks. In both cases, you see a orange bar, and that reflects the emissions from manufacturing the vehicle. So you can see that all of them have it. The emissions for manufacturing the vehicle are higher for trucks than for cars, but slightly lower for electric cars compared to gas cars. However, you have to factor in the emissions from producing the battery, and that's the blue line. So you can see that electric cars and electric trucks both have not insignificant global warming emissions produced by creating the battery. They're larger for the truck than they are for the car. And when you add the battery manufacturing and the vehicle manufacturing emissions, the upfront emissions from electric vehicles are higher than those of their gas counterparts. But over the lifetime of the vehicle, they are much lower once you factor in the operating emissions, which is basically the combustion of the fuel or the generation of the electricity. So for a gas car, you can see that the reduction is 52% over the life of the vehicle. For the truck, it's 57%. This, again, is assuming the average electricity mix of the country as a whole, which is a little bit dirtier than what we have here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So the reduction would be even starker for an electric vehicle charged up on our grid here at home. But this graphic to us drives home 2 points. One is that over the life of the car, electric vehicles clearly win out in terms of global warming emissions. And two, there are much fewer emissions associated with cars and smaller cars compared to trucks or larger vehicles. So from a climate perspective, if you need a car, the best thing you can do is drive the smallest electric vehicle that meets your needs. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of public health and safety as well. I've mentioned a couple times that we have clean energy standards in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that are why our grid right now is cleaner than the region and the country as a whole. The good news is that electric vehicles will only get cleaner over time as both Massachusetts and Rhode Island add more renewable energy thanks to those standards. So if you buy an electric vehicle today, 5 years from now, it will be cleaner. Even if it's the same exact vehicle, it will be cleaner because our electricity mix will be cleaner. And you definitely can't say the same thing about a gas car. So how do all those standards work? We would need a whole webinar to talk about that. But for Massachusetts, we're sharing this graphic from the Department of Environmental Protection, which shows how the various standards stack on top of each other. I definitely don't have time to go through what all of those standards are, but I will point to 2025, 63% of our electricity mix comes from non-fossil fuels. So that's 37% is fossil fuels. And that fossil fuel slice is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller in the coming years, thanks to all of those standards, which means those EV emissions will go down year by year by year. In Rhode Island, the graphic is a little simpler. The renewable energy standard ramps up the amount of our electricity that comes from renewable sources year after year until we meet 100% in 2033. And that, again, means that an electric vehicle will get more and more efficient in terms of emissions year after year after year. I do want to pause or take a moment to acknowledge that emissions in terms of air pollution are not the only environmental impacts of producing or driving vehicles. There are absolutely environmental and social harms related to any kind of resource extraction, whether we're talking about oil, coal, or methane, or any other fossil fuel that we're digging out of the ground all over the world, or lithium, graphite, nickel, or any of the other minerals and metals that we use in manufacturing electric vehicle batteries specifically, but also vehicles generally. We like to point to a resource that adds up the sheer tonnage of raw materials that need to be pulled out of the ground for a fossil fuel-based economy versus a clean energy-based economy. And that math shows that a fossil fuel-based economy requires hundreds of times more mining than a clean energy-based economy. And the good news with EV batteries in particular is that when the batteries reach the end of their useful life in a vehicle, we can still use those batteries for stationary storage to balance out supply and demand on the electric grid or provide backup power at buildings. And when those batteries reach the end of that useful life, they can be recycled and we can recover those minerals. So the combination of this reuse and recycling and better battery chemistries over time will reduce the need for new mining over time. We could spend so many hours going through each of the individual minerals or metals and figuring out where they come from and how they're being used and all of that. But the overall point here is that we only need to pull those things out of the ground once, and then we can reuse and recycle, as opposed to a fossil fuel-based economy where we have to continually pump out these fossil fuels, whether we're talking about the United States or the Niger Delta or so many other places in the world. A lot of people on this front get very interested in recycling, which we are too. And this is the best resource that we can point to illustrate this idea. It's a couple years old now, and I'm looking forward to a new one, but it comes from the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT. And what they did is look at the installed recycling capacity for electric vehicle batteries and the announced electric vehicle recycling plants every year from when they did this analysis through the end of through half of the century. Obviously, the further we go out on this graph, the more assumptions there are. But for the near term, they looked really closely at announcements about new battery recycling plants or plans or partnerships to build out this graph. And basically, as of September 2023, there was enough installed and announced recycling capacity to carry us through the 2030s. So this, I think, is a rare good news story in this space. If you haven't heard of Redwood Materials, they're one of the larger recycling companies in this space that has partnered with lots of automakers to not only recycle the old batteries, but then supply some of those minerals and raw materials for new batteries. So they're definitely a company to watch if you're interested in this space. All of the federal threats to the Inflation Reduction Act are definitely something to watch in this space too, because there were significant incentives to build recycling plants that are now at risk. But the good news is that the minerals and the materials in these batteries are so valuable that a recycling supply chain will build itself up. We just have to keep making sure that it's building itself up fast enough. But for the moment, we're actually ahead of schedule.